Tonight, is your pension in peril?
I could be sitting and enjoying the sun because I would have retired, but that dream has gone because my pension is totally zeroed.
We go undercover to investigate the techniques used to target your retirement savings.
To promote that fear, to trigger that emotion, to get that word stuck in his head, because that's a big word, that is danger.
I bet he could quote sections of Wolf of Wall Street back to you.
A UK ban on pension cold calling could be on the way, so why might your phone still keep ringing?
When you look abroad, overseas call centres, they can do pension cold calling.
Why risky investments can ruin your retirement.
This is what somebody is expecting to live on for the rest of their life, and you're taking that away from them.
Good evening and welcome to the Tonight programme. With continuing low interest rates, many of us are keen to look for better returns on our investments. That can make us vulnerable to seductive pitches from cold callers who want to persuade us to move our money. A recent campaign to highlight the problem has resulted in a promise to clamp down on unsolicited pension calls. But as Adam Shaw reveals, a Tonight special undercover investigation provides new evidence of why the proposed ban on pension cold calling might not work.
When I was younger, spending cash on trying to look good was more important than saving money for my retirement. You learn a lot as you grow up, but there's one thing few get an education in, and that's how to manage your pension. Like many of us, members of the Diggle Village Brass Band would like to learn more about their pension. A lot of people don't know the details of their pension. I mean, do you know the growth rate?
No.
Do you know the management charges?
No, I couldn't tell you.
And do you know what kind of pension it is?
No.
Do you think you have enough money to retire on?
Probably not.
Our lack of knowledge about pensions is great news for some. The Financial Conduct Authority has recently warned swindles are on the rise. According to the Treasury, 11 million people with pensions each year are targeted by cold calls. At best, those calls can be very annoying. At worst, they can be very expensive. Those calls really took off a couple of years ago when the government relaxed the rules around what you could do with your pension pot, so-called pension freedoms. Tom McPhail is a leading pensions expert.
The good aspect of pension freedoms is the fact that you have control over your money, you have the freedom to take the money out when you want. However, that has really opened the door for people who don't have the customer's best interests at heart to persuade them to invest their retirement savings in investments which are either very risky or in some cases downright fraudulent.
There's growing concern about the rise in risky ways to save for your pension, known as unregulated investments. Ex-serviceman Alan Garr found out the hard way. Hi, Alan.
Good morning, Adam. How are you?
I'm all right. Nice to see you.
To see you nice as with you.
OK. This 56-year-old former military engineer is struggling to earn a living, driving children with special needs to and from school.
It's 20 hours a week on a basic wage. Which,
what, minimum wage?
Yeah, it doesn't pay the bills.
Alan had two pensions, including a final salary pension guaranteeing him an annual income. Together, they were worth £50,000. But while recovering from cancer 5 years ago, Alan received a cold call.
They called me up and said that they knew I had a military pension. Basically, they told me that my pensions were not doing so good being held within the government, saying they've been making roughly 3 to 4% at the time. And I said, well, that's not too bad. But they said I can get you a minimum of 15 to 30%.
So 10 times?
Yes.
They're saying you can get 10 times what you're
Yes, I thought, well, that's happy days as far as I'm concerned.
After the initial cold call, Alan was contacted by Cherish Wealth Management. He says the firm suggested he invest savings into exotic schemes, such as property developments in Detroit and ethical forests in Costa Rica.
It talks about your attitude to risk.
Medium risk, yes.
But doesn't this say it's all your money is in the high risk?
That's the paperwork they sent me after the account was open running.
That's very odd.
Alan has little to show for his pension savings. The forestry scheme has gone into liquidation and the Detroit housing project hasn't provided any returns for the past 2 years.
Your life savings have disappeared?
They've basically disappeared, yes. There's no money in my account apart from, I think it's £1,125.
If they were sat here, the people who took your pension and invested it, what would you say to them?
Why are you doing that to people?
Time to meet former policeman Steve Wright. He's a director of the company behind the Detroit housing scheme.
So this is how it works. Now, remember Cherish Wealth Management? Well, back in 2012, they suggested that Alan invest in some rather high-risk schemes. Until 2011, this man, Steve Wright, was a director of Cherish Wealth Management. And they would suggest that people could earn more if they moved their pension into unregulated schemes like the Detroit housing development Invest US.
Steve Wright was a director of some of these companies, which include Real Estate Investments USA, Biomass Investments, Lakeview UK Investments, and Brisa Investments.
And not only did the promised high levels of returns not always materialise, there's another problem.
The independent auditors who examined some of these companies' books had a range of misgivings, including loan breaches, whether another firm was a going concern, and worries over one company's ownership. Steve Wright denies any conflict of interest. He says at no point, either before or after resigning, was he privy to Cherish Wealth Management's advice to its clients. On the auditor's concerns, he says these accounts have been challenged, deficiencies have been accepted and are in the process of being refiled. And the companies stopped accepting investments once they had defaulted on interest payments. Luke Sharman's company helps those who think they've been missold a pension investment. Some get their money back, but others are beyond help.
We might speak to hundreds of people every day, and more often than not, we can't help them because they're in a position where they've not dealt with a regulated company. It is just shocking because these people are now going to have to work the rest of their lives without a pension.
They say they represent hundreds of clients where Steve Wright has been involved.
They've been left in financial difficulty and they're now working longer than they need to be and not spending the money in retirement.
Cherish Wealth Management went into liquidation last year, but at the same West Midlands address, we found a new company with a strikingly similar name, Cherish Premier Wealth. See what they did there? Steve Wright isn't a director, but we heard the new company were still persuading people to move their money into risky, unregulated investments.
Hello, is this Cherish?
And this time, they're also doing the cold calling.
Welcome to Cherish Premier Wealth.
So we went undercover. Our first surprise...
Ta-da! Here I am from No Sea.
It's Steve Wright. Ta-da indeed.
This is Steve Wright, the managing director of the company. Hello.
Despite the introduction, Steve Wright says he's never been a director of Cherish Premier Wealth. At the time we filmed, he was the director of Cherish Support Services. He's here for the new staff training, led by call centre manager Qasim Rafiq.
There are two reasons why people buy. It's mainly because it's either fear or it's greed.
The training consists of listening to recordings of Qasim's successful sales pitches.
Nobody knows about, how much they get in charge and management fee. The danger of these things. What did I just do there?
The danger.
Danger. To promote that fear, to trigger that emotion, to get that word stuck in his head, because that's a big word, that is danger.
So, first of all, his strategy for selling, fear, create fear in the clients. As a strategy, what do you think of it?
I bet he knows whole sections. He could quote sections of Wolf of Wall Street back to you. The whole thing is very high pressure.
Cherish Premier Wealth says this is a standard sales training observation. Next, here's the pitch that suggests just signing up will discourage existing pension providers from increasing their fees.
When we do a review for you, we contact the provider, so they kind of know that they're under investigation. People who do that on a regular basis, pension providers will be very careful of increasing the management charges because they know this person's filled on.
There's a suggestion here that they'll say, look, come to us and we'll call up your pension provider and say, we're watching you, you better keep your management charges low. Does it work like that?
This is not like your mobile phone contract. Pension companies don't work like that. They review their charges regularly. They are not going to cut the charges just because you ring them up and ask them to do it. It does not work like that.
Before finding out the potential client's current fees, our reporter is taught to suggest consolidating their existing pensions through Cherish Premier Wealth will also save them money.
What we can look into that for you is accumulating all three of those pensions together, so you're only paying one set of management fees. It's actually going to save you more money in the long run. Does that make sense?
Okay, so we can say that, we can say about. Okay. So I wasn't sure if that
and then that
kind of advice that we're not.
No, that's selling. That's going to sell.
It is factually what she's saying possibly right?
Probably not, because with most pensions, you typically only pay a percentage fee. So consolidate them into one place might make it easier to manage your pension, but it probably of itself wouldn't cut the management costs at all.
Cherish Premier Wealth deny our example is a misleading sales tactic, but the poor reputation of the wider pension cold call industry means there are now growing demands for a clampdown.
It seems to go in threes. They will ring you up, you'll put the phone down. A few hours later, they will ring you up again.
Same person?
The same person or the same company. And you'll get rung a couple of days later as well. That's what they seem to do. Persistence.
And even if you said, I'm not interested, they just keep calling back?
Yeah. And they ignore the fact that you're not interested, and they ignore the fact that they've actually rung you before.
I find it a nuisance, and I don't think it should happen, because of these people are trained, they know what to say to stay on the phone for as long as possible and get you hooked into it.
People can be easily worried by somebody on the phone, and because it's something that people don't know enough about, it's very easy to be drawn into.
They're very direct and they can play on people's emotions. Just with the promise of hundreds of thousands of pounds in retirement, these people will stay on the phone and invite these people into their homes willingly to go ahead with the pension review.
Hello, my name's Naomi. I'm calling from Cherish Premier.
At Cherish Premier Wealth, our undercover reporter and her colleagues are each expected to make 300 calls every day. We found that sometimes this means calling people who've already said they wanted to be left alone.
Hang on. Yeah, okay.
Press hammer, and then it just automatically put the mic in.
Okay.
And what we tend to do is when we get quickly anyway, to piss them off.
Okay.
So it's the only way you can get them back though.
Yeah.
Ringing back customers who've made it clear they are not interested is a breach of industry rules. Cherish Premier Wealth says this is a deficiency and they will redouble its training efforts. But it's not just Cherish Premier Wealth. Other companies in the UK also use cold calling to target people's pensions. Darren Cook's been a financial advisor for 25 years and has seen a rise in pension cold calls. He decided to persuade the government to take on the bad boys who target vulnerable people's retirement savings.
This is what somebody is expecting to live on and have as an income and a support for the rest of their life. You're condemning them, in many cases, to a life of not much more than poverty. You're stealing their future, and quite literally, and sometimes their lives, because I have heard of victims of scams committing suicide.
Darren began a one-man campaign to reform the entire pension cold-calling industry.
The dream aim of the campaign was to try and put the scammers out of business. We started to get a lot of support from industry, and that's, I think, when we really started to raise awareness at government level, that actually this wasn't just a little petition, it was a bit more serious than that.
If such cold calls are successful, people will get to meet the likes of this guy. Nick Wingfield is Cherish Premier Wealth's so-called senior pension expert.
Hello.
Yes, Nick.
Hi, Nick. Hi.
Okay.
Are you all right?
Yes, I'm all right.
His job is to collect information and make introductions to independent financial advisors by getting the client to sign over access to their pension details. He's not qualified to give financial advice. To do so is against the Financial Conduct Authority's rules. He's meeting another undercover reporter. She's pretending to be a nurse who now works for Bupa. Her pension pot is very safe in a secure final salary scheme that will be hard to beat. Yet it doesn't stop the unqualified consultant from trying to persuade her to move.
There will be fees within whatever pension they suggest you go into, but that's normal. There's always fees within a pension fund.
Does that add up to more fees than I'm paying in Bupa, do you think?
You have to do a lot of digging to find out what you're paying Bupa. Yeah.
So, if she's in a final salary scheme, she's not paying any fees. The employer pays the administration costs. So the question of fees and charges is completely irrelevant to her for as long as she's in the final salary scheme.
So that's another bit of nonsense.
Absolutely, it's another bit of nonsense designed to bamboozle her.
During the meeting, Nick appears very keen to stress the possible benefits of transferring into another fund.
Do you think on the balance sheet you're better off out than in them? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, that would be verging on advice, which I wouldn't give you, but what I can say is, if on a purely financial basis, it's fairly obvious that targeting 5 or 6% growth on a long-term investment is going to produce a lot more than something that's growing by inflation when we're in a low inflation environment.
That seems to me not as clear as he's making out. He's saying 5 or 6% growth is certainly going to give you more than where you are now, but that may not be the case.
Absolutely, and it's not guaranteed. And he's talking about moving her out of a secure, defined benefit pension where she knows what she'll get into a stock market-based investment where she might get more or less depending on how things perform. But he didn't explain any of that to her. It sounded awfully like advice to me, and it sounded awfully like very dangerous advice to me. This whole conversation shouldn't be taking place.
Nick named the firm of independent financial advisors who would draw up the final recommendations and handle our reporter's pension transfer. We've since learned the Financial Conduct Authority have banned this firm from handling any pension transfers. And there's more. When the company was operating, one of their representatives offered products through a firm of fund managers. In turn, the fund managers placed some of their clients' money in companies where, you guessed it, Steve Wright was a director. Nick Wingfield acknowledges that his response about fees in final salary pensions was poor. However, he denies trying to bamboozle our reporter. Cherish Premier Wealth say individuals are quite able to give generic advice and/or information without contravening Financial Conduct Authority guidelines. They added Mr. Wingfield knew the limits of what he could say. Back in Derbyshire, financial advisor and campaigner Darren Cook has had a breakthrough in his campaign to put a stop to pension cold calling.
This is the email that I received announcing the ban on pension cold calling. It did take quite a time to actually understand what was happening, really, I think, because it was so wonderful.
The plans for a ban on cold calling have been postponed until after the general election. But if implemented, will send out an important message both to customers and rogue firms. Back undercover, our reporter finds Cherish Premier Wealth appears to be one step ahead of the proposed clampdown.
We kind of got in contact with the call centre abroad to generate this lead. We've got one in Pakistan with 5 agents on the phone, hopefully, fingers crossed. Then I've got a trip made to India and a return where we've got 10 agents on the phone. We've got 2 other call centres, one in Hungary, Budapest. We've got one in South Africa who also want to do business with us. Everybody abroad, overseas call centres, they can do pension cold calling.
Interestingly, even before the government installs any sort of cold calling ban, they're setting up call centres abroad. I think they mentioned Pakistan amongst 2 or 3 others.
Yeah, and South Africa, so they're looking at moving right out of the UK. And this is part of the problem, is that the Financial Conduct Authority can control regulated businesses in this country. The government can make it illegal to cold call in this country, but it can never stop telephone calls, emails, tweets, messages from around the world. It cannot control every jurisdiction in the world.
Cherish Premier Wealth say they have not put in place a plan to get round any ban, and that Qasim Rafiq was indulging in a bit of sales puff that overstated the position. They say they collect information and make introductions to regulated entities which may or may not result in sales being made. In a statement, Mr. Wright, Mr. Rafiq and Mr. Wingfield say they deny the varied accusations. In companies where Steve Wright was a director, he says not all the investments underperformed. Investors received advice from independent financial advisors on whether the investments were appropriate for their level of risk, and they were high-risk investments which aimed to deliver high returns. Steve Wright says he remains confident that investors in the Detroit housing scheme, like Alan Garr, will get their funds returned in the medium term.
I could have had a happier life right now. I could be sitting, sipping, having a cold beer and enjoying the sun, because I would have retired. But that dream has gone because I can't get near my pension, because my pension is totally zeroed.